I'm going to go now to Abayomi Azikiwe. That he will be our next speaker. He's the editor of Pan-African Newswire and a graduate of Wayne State University in Detroit. In political economy as well as organizational and administrative studies. Azikiwe has worked for several decades in solidarity with various liberation movements and progressive governments in Africa, the Caribbean, and in other parts of the world. He also serves as political analyst for various satellite television networks and press agencies internationally. So Abayomi, please go ahead.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Desai. I want to also thank the International Manifesto Group for this invitation. This is the second time I've been able to present over this medium. I would like to speak on three different important topics related to our case against NATO. I want to talk about the historical legacy of the Cold War that still remains with us today in the 21st century. I also want to touch on some of the military strategies that were used during the height of the Cold War against national liberation movements and socialist-oriented governments in Africa and Asia and Latin America, and also to touch on some of the emerging characteristics of imperialism in the 21st century. While the Pentagon and the United States State Department continues to provide a distorted rationale for the instigation of a major military conflict in Eastern Europe, billions of dollars are being utilized to transfer offensive weapons aimed at preventing a peaceful resolution to the current war in Ukraine. Now, although the corporate and government-controlled media outlets in Western Europe and in North America have reported to the public on a daily basis that their own administrations cannot be blamed for the current war in Ukraine, for any serious observer, the culpability for the tensions now in existence on an international level can be traced back to the desire by imperialism to expand the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. NATO was formed in 1949 in the aftermath of the Second World War, and the initiation of the Cold War by Washington against the rising socialist and national liberation movements around the world. In 1949, only two countries on the African continent were considered independent. That was Ethiopia and Liberia. Both of these countries in 1949 were highly compromised due to the intervention of the United States and Britain in their internal affairs, stemming from the legacy of African enslavement and the rise of imperialist fascism during the 1920s and 1930s, initially in Italy and later in Germany. The founding members of NATO were all in North America and Western Europe. They were Belgium, Canada, Denmark, France, Iceland, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Norway, Portugal, and of course the United Kingdom and the United States. Many of these states were involved in the Atlantic slave trade and colonialism. All of them benefited from the super exploitation of African and other oppressed peoples after the transformation of the world economic system, which began during the 15th century. The outcome of the World War I and World War II left the US as the dominant imperialist power in the world. The only real effective challenge to the hegemony of the United States and its allies during the post-World War II period were the socialist states of the USSR, the People's Republic of China, which was founded in 1949 after more than 2 decades of armed struggle, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, which was consolidated in 1948, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam in the north, which declared independence in August of 1945, along with other anti-capitalist, anti-colonial, anti-neo-colonial movements, which arose in Africa, Asia, the Caribbean, and Latin America, which were objectively bolstered by burgeoning African-American and worker struggles in the United States, which developed during the late 1940s and 1950s. The position of the United States during the 1950s and 1960s represented the height of political hypocrisy. African Americans were being denied fundamental civil rights protections, which were originally put in place during the period after the Civil War of 1861 to 1865. There were civil rights acts and amendments to the US Constitution as early as 1866 in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War. These measures were ostensibly designed to reconstruct some semblance of democratic governance. Nonetheless, the Reconstruction process was overthrown during the latter decades of the 19th century, which placed African Americans in the social position of neo-slavery at worst and second-class citizenship at best. Participants in the leading civil rights organizations after World War II were pressured to denounce the socialist camp and to pledge allegiance to United States imperialism as the only legitimate system of governance, not only domestically, but also internationally. Those leading activists and public figures who refused to adopt the Cold War policies of Washington were subjected to investigations, prosecution, imprisonment, economic isolation, and exile. All the while, African Americans were being lynched by mobs, killed without justification by police, executed by the state, and denied fundamental due process and equal protection under the law. In 1949, of course, there was the Paris Peace Conference, and several leading African-American leftists attended, people such as Paul Robeson, Dr. W.B. Du Bois, Shirley Graham Du Bois. All of them were subjected to persecution in the aftermath of their attendance at this conference in 1949. In 1950, they had their passports seized. Some were prosecuted or attempted to be convicted for espionage, people such as W.B. Du Bois. Paul Robeson, of course, had his passport seized, isolated from being able to earn a living as an artist in the United States. And people like Alpheus Hunton, W. Alpheus Hunton, who was a co-founder of the Council on African Affairs, was, of course, put in prison for a period of time due to his activism. Now, I'd like to go on very quickly to talk about some of the repressive actions that were taken prior to the formation of NATO in the immediate aftermath of World War II. Now, two examples of repression and mass killings by countries in the aftermath of World War II were carried out in the French-controlled North African state of Algeria and the British-controlled Gold Coast, which was later known as Ghana after independence in 1957. Now, these acts by the colonial powers were designed to preserve imperialist rule in Africa. Both Britain and France were founding members of NATO. In Algeria, on the same day that the Nazi German government surrendered on May 8th of 1945, there was a huge massacre that began in Algeria due to the fact that people went out into the streets not only to celebrate the defeat of Germany, but also to call for Algerian independence. Now, this was on May 8th of 1945. Thousands rallied in Sétif and as Allied powers, including colonial rulers of France, marked a hard-won victory in Europe over Nazi Germany. The people chanted, "Long live the Allied victory." Of course, the French opened fire on these crowds, which led to further violence that resulted in the deaths of thousands of people. About a decade later, in 1954, the Front National Liberation, the FLN, was formed. They embarked upon an 8-year revolutionary armed struggle and diplomatic struggle to win independence in Algeria. And of course, this year represents the 60th anniversary of the independence of Algeria. Also in the Gold Coast, in 1948, on February the 28th, African veterans of war who coalesced with traditional leaders to demand better conditions under British colonialism. The veterans from the Gold Coast wanted benefits for their service during the war. And traditional leaders wanted a reduction in prices for goods that were controlled by the British colonial authorities. The same or similar response that was carried out in Algeria in 1945 was also carried out in the Gold Coast in 1948, of course, leading to splits within the United Gold Coast Convention, the formation of the Convention People's Party by Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, and then, of course, the liberation of Ghana in 1957. So the founding members of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization were very much steeped in the legacy of African enslavement, of colonization, and also military repression against the independence movements. In closing, I'd just like to touch on, and perhaps we can get more deeply into this during the question and answer period, the modern impact of imperialism and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. We can discuss the destruction of Libya some 11 years ago when NATO embarked upon a 7-month bombing campaign that destroyed the entire infrastructure of the country, killed anywhere between 50,000 and 100,000 people who were Libyans and people living in Libya. They created a tremendous economic depression. Today, Libya is a center for human trafficking and internecine conflict. They have still not been able to install a stable government there after some 11 years of imperialist NATO intervention. And finally, the economic impact of NATO's policy has been disastrous for working people in the United States, in Britain, in Western Europe, and moreover, in West Asia and in Africa, because both Russia and Ukraine are considered major players in agricultural production. And due to the sanctions that have been imposed on Russia, due to the failure of the United States to prevent a war in Ukraine, there's going to be a serious problem with food deficits in Africa and West Asia and other parts of the world. We already see here in the United States the rapid rise in fuel prices and food prices, the cost of transportation. We see as well the rise in rents and services here in the United States. The fact that the minimum wage has not been raised in the United States in many, many years magnifies the problem. Also coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic, there has been an inflationary spiral that has been initiated in the United States. I'll end right there, and perhaps we can take these issues up further during the question and answer period. Thank you once again for the invitation. It's such an honor to be on a panel with all these comrades from People's Republic of China, from Canada, from South Africa, the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, and so forth. Thank you so much.
I'm Michael Hudson. I'm appearing here for the International Manifesto Group. If you like this video and ones like it, please subscribe. For more information, go to the address on the screen.